Tonight we'll drift into a place where shadows stretch softly, where myths don't roar but murmur, where even gods sigh and sip tea brewed from twilight. So dim your lights, settle under your blanket, take a deep breath like you're sinking slowly into velvet, and if this calm journey helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right. And if you're feeling cozy enough, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Because tonight's tale comes from the stillest corners of ancient memory, a place far below Olympus where Hades, the least talkative of the gods, once puzzled over something strange, something ordinary, something you've probably never thought about too much either. A door, but not just any door, a door that only opens inward. Hades was not a flashy god. He did not throw lightning or play music on golden strings or chase love across mountaintops. He ruled the underworld, a place of silence and roots, of memory and forgetting. And one quiet morning, if you can call anything down there morning, he stood in front of a stone doorway carved into the side of a hall no one ever entered, watching as the heavy slab refused to budge outward, no matter how hard he pulled. And he wasn't annoyed, just curious. The way you get when your sock keeps sliding off inside your boot or when your tea tastes faintly of rosemary, even though you never added any. So he tugged again, grunted softly, then stepped back and pushed gently. And with a deep, sleepy groan, the door creaked inward, cool air sighing out like a yawn that had waited centuries to stretch. And he stepped inside, not out of purpose, but out of wondering. The same kind of wondering that makes you open a drawer you haven't looked in for years. And inside was nothing at first glance. Just a square room with no furniture, no candles, no echo, only a soft feeling like you'd walked into your own thoughts. And he stood there silent, until Karen the boatman popped his head in and mumbled, "You break it." To which Hades replied, "No, I think it was always meant to open this way." And that's how it began. This curiosity about doors and why some open out and others in, and he started to notice it everywhere. In the halls of judgment, in the shrines of memory, in the kitchens where souls baked translucent pies filled with longing and cinnamon. Some doors swung outward into chaos, others inward into calm, and the difference began to matter, slowly, the way rain doesn't soak you all at once but seeps in with patience. So Hades, never one to rush, began building a little room off to the side of his private garden, which mostly grew mushrooms and whispering vines. And he built it with one intention only, a door that opens only inward, no handle on the outside, no hinges for escape, just a place to enter only when you are ready to be inside. And the first thing he placed inside was a single chair made from memories. Not flashy ones, just the small kind. Like that time you remembered the name of an old classmate while washing your hands, or the sound your shoes made on the last day of school. And he sat, and he listened, and the room didn't speak, but it held him, and that was enough. And maybe you too have a door like that in your mind. One that doesn't open with a key or a kick, but only when you lean into it softly, only when the noise of the world fades, and you find yourself alone with your quietest thoughts. And as Hades returned again and again to the room with the inward door, he added little things. A teacup that refilled only when forgotten, a clock with no hands, a rug made of all the sighs people let out when they didn't know they were holding their breath. And the room became a haven, not because it hid anything, but because it invited stillness. And that's where we leave him tonight, for now, sipping thought-steeped tea in a chair built from almost memories, behind a door that no one could force open, only welcome. There was, tucked in the folds of Hades' cloak pocket, a key he had carried for centuries without ever using, a small, slightly crooked thing shaped more like a question mark than a tool, and he couldn't remember where he'd found it, or if it had even belonged to him to begin with. But every now and then it would press gently against his ribs as he walked through the deeper parts of the underworld, reminding him of itself without insisting. And one evening, if such a time could be called evening in a place that obeyed no sun, he took it out, held it between his fingers, and asked the hallway, "What do you open?" Not expecting an answer, and naturally he got none, because silence was fluent in this part of the world. So he wandered key in hand through quiet halls lined with portraits that never looked directly at him, past sleeping rivers and doorways made of shadow, trying it in various locks, not with urgency, but with a kind of idle wondering, and every lock resisted, as if politely saying, "Not me, but thanks for thinking of me." And eventually, he stopped at a small alcove he'd never paid much attention to before, where there was no door, no handle, just a wall of stone carved with the outline of an opening that wasn't really there, and out of pure sleepy curiosity, he held the key up to the stone, not to insert, just to compare, and something inside the rock shifted ever so slightly, not unlocking but unburdening like an old back loosening after a long nap. And a thought passed through Hades not in words but in sensation. This key wasn't meant to open things, it was meant to remind him not everything should, and he chuckled softly, because that was very Underworld of it. So he returned to his favourite inward opening room, placed the key on the rug beside his memory chair, and let it rest, like a thought you're not ready to finish yet but don't want to forget. And from that day forward, whenever someone asked him about secrets or forbidden doors or legendary locks, he would nod thoughtfully and say, "Sometimes the key is just a weight your fingers need to feel, and maybe you too carry something like that. A question without a door, a memory with no latch, a curiosity you haven't solved not because you failed, but because it was never meant to be opened, only held, like an old friend who sits beside you in silence and never asks why." It started as a simple piece of furniture in one of the quieter corners of the Underworld, tucked between a crumbling bookshelf filled with half-finished epics and a window that didn't look out to anything in particular, a couch, well, more like a very determined pile of cushions covered in something velvet adjacent, that Hades had picked up centuries ago from a forgotten temple lobby where it had once served heroes waiting for judgment. And though he never sat on it much, he liked knowing it was there, a place that asked for nothing but a little wait and maybe a nap if one felt brave enough to sleep in a room with no clocks. But over the years, and there were many, it began to sink, slowly, almost politely, the way old things do when they've seen more than their share of stories and don't feel the need to stand upright about it anymore. And one day, when Hades finally lowered himself onto it, with a sigh that might have been his or the couch's or both, he realized that it was no longer just furniture. It was a companion, shaped perfectly to the weight of whoever sat on it. Not in a magical way, but in that quiet, physical way of familiarity, the same way your favourite sweater stretches in just the right places, or how your pillow flattens where your dreams tend to rest. And he chuckled softly, running a hand along the threadbare edge where hundreds of elbows must have rested in silence, and thought, "This is the most honest seat in the realm," because it held not just bodies, but hesitation, reflection, small griefs, and wordless peace. And over time, the couch became a destination, not announced or formal, but known. Judges came to sit after long hearings, shades rested on it after particularly emotional retellings, and even Cerberus once curled against it during a thunder rumble that reminded him of his puphood, and no one spoke loudly near it. It was understood that the couch had its own gravity, drawing you into stillness the same way a slow song fills a room, and eventually Hades placed a small sign above it, not carved or etched, but simply painted in soft ink that read, "Lower slowly," because that's what the couch asked of you. Not to collapse, not to perch, but to arrive gently, to surrender without rush. And maybe you too have a place like that, real or imagined, where your body remembers how to sink, how to melt without disappearing, how to settle into the shape of your quiet. And tonight, as this story tucks itself around you like a familiar cushion, let yourself soften with it and feel the gravity of stillness welcome you home. Down one of the less visited corridors in the Underworld, where the walls hummed softly like old lullabies trapped in stone, and the air carried the quiet scent of parchment and ash, there was a room, small, square, unassuming, with a lock so ancient it had grown smooth from the passage of time, and no one, not even Hades, could quite recall why it had been sealed in the first place. Only that it had always been locked, always passed without question, like that drawer in your home that no longer opens but still holds its shape out of respect, until one slow day Hades stopped in front of it, not with intention, but the way you stop when something forgotten suddenly feels slightly less so, and he placed his hand on the door, not turning anything, not pushing, just resting there, and the lock, without a click or ceremony, released with a sigh so soft it sounded like a book being closed in another room, and the door creaked open on its own, revealing a space filled not with secrets or treasures, but the unmistakable stillness of something left alone for a very long time. The kind of stillness that wraps around you like a memory and makes your ears ring with silence. And inside were shelves of items no one had claimed. A pair of sandals too worn to remember their path, a scroll rolled tight but empty, a teacup filled with dust shaped like fingerprints, and in the centre, a stool facing the wall as if someone had once sat there to think but forgot to finish the thought. And Hades didn't speak, just stepped in, sat down gently, and looked at the wall, waiting for it to say something. But it didn't, because that wasn't its job. And after a while he realised the room wasn't locked because it was dangerous, or secret, or sacred, but simply because someone had once needed a space to pause without interruption, and in forgetting the reason for the lock, the room had become something even more valuable. A place with no purpose, no expectation, no noise, just a soft echo of presence. And when he stood to leave, he didn't close the door, didn't lock it again, just let it rest half open, like an old notebook left on a bedside table. And from then on, when someone in the Underworld needed time, not answers, not solutions, just time, they would find their way to that room and sit quietly until their thoughts caught up with them. And maybe tonight, you too can imagine that room inside yourself, a space that asks nothing, holds everything, and exists not to be solved, but to be sat in, a gentle reminder that not all locks are for keeping things out. Some are there until you're ready to go in. It was small, squat, and a little lopsided, an unimpressive little candle resting on a shelf in Hades' private study, tucked between a stack of scrolls no one had read in millennia, and a dish of dried olives he kept around more for the memory than the flavour. And it had been lit, so the story went, long ago during a conversation no one could quite remember, between Hades and someone who mattered once. Maybe a hero, maybe a ghost, maybe just someone who had the right kind of silence in their voice. And ever since that night the candle had never gone out, not in windless halls, not through centuries of quiet, not even when the Underworld trembled with emotion, or when time folded in strange directions. And what made it unusual wasn't the flame, soft and low like the last breath of a bedtime story. It was the way it never asked for attention, never flared, never flickered for drama, just continued steady and dim, the kind of light that didn't illuminate a room but made it feel remembered, and Hades never moved it, never replaced it, just let it be, like a punctuation mark in a sentence that had forgotten what it was trying to say. And over time others noticed it too, a judge passing through to drop off an old ledger, a poet ghost looking for the right corner to whisper into, and they would pause, glance at the candle, then keep walking, somehow a bit calmer, as if the flame had offered them a place to leave a thought they weren't ready to say aloud. And once Persephone asked him, "What do you think it burns for?" And Hades, after thinking a long while, replied, "I think it burns for whatever we bring into the room." And that was the truth of it, that the candle didn't burn out because it wasn't burning fuel. It was burning memory, burning pause, burning the space between words where meaning curls up and sleeps. And every now and then Hades would sit near it, not close enough to warm his hands, just close enough to feel like he was sharing a moment with something that understood stillness. And maybe you too have a candle like that inside you. Not the kind that blazes with purpose, but the kind that glows softly with presence. And tonight, as your thoughts begin to slow and your body leans gently into rest, let that little light hold its space in you, asking nothing, offering everything, a flame that doesn't lead the way forward, but reminds you that where you are is already enough. Tucked in the farthest corner of Hades' library, not the public one filled with winding shelves and dramatic statues, but the smaller private room where only dust, stillness and old ideas gathered, stood a mirror, tall and narrow with a frame of twisted vine iron, and unlike most mirrors, it didn't shine or sparkle or try to show you something clever. In fact, it hardly showed anything at all, just a muted version of whatever stood in front of it. like a memory of a reflection instead of the real thing. And Hades didn't remember acquiring it, only that it had always been there, as if the room itself had grown around it. And one evening, when the air felt especially like unanswered questions, he found himself standing before it, waiting for something. What? He wasn't sure. Maybe a sign, maybe a glimpse, maybe some version of himself he hadn't yet met. But the mirror offered no revelations, no hidden truths, no sparkle of recognition, only the same tired face he always carried and the soft echo of his own breath. And at first he felt disappointed. But then he looked closer, not at the surface, but at the feeling it gave, like a sigh you didn't mean to let out. And he realized this mirror wasn't broken or enchanted. It was just honest. The kind of honesty that doesn't try to fix you or flatter you, only reflect the version of you that shows up without effort. And so he kept it there, untouched, unpolished, not as decoration, but as company, a presence that didn't require interaction. And over the years others would stumble upon it, usually by accident, and each would react differently. Some with discomfort, some with laughter, some with relief. And the mirror never changed, never judged, only continued to reflect what was already there. And maybe that was the point, that in a realm filled with transformation, myth and grandeur, this one object dared to do nothing but stay the same, offering the most radical gift of all, stillness. And perhaps tonight, in the quiet space between your thoughts, there's a mirror like that too, not asking you to look better or deeper or harder, just to look and accept. And as you drift gently into rest, know that even if nothing feels new, even if all you see is what you've already been, that too is enough. And sometimes, the most sacred reflection is the one that simply lets you be. In one of the oddly shaped courtyards of the Underworld, behind a weeping stone archway and next to a fig tree that bore fruit only in dreams, there lay a staircase, if you could call it that consisted of just a single step carved into black basalt. Not high, not low, not cracked. Just one modest descent that didn't lead anywhere obvious, and people often mistook it for a broken stairway, as if the rest had crumbled away or hadn't yet been built. But Hades knew better, for he had once tried to build more steps beyond it, bringing masons and planners and even calling in a favour from Hephaestus to see if it could be extended. But every attempt to add another step either vanished by morning or circled back to the original one, like the space around it refused to go deeper than that single patient dip. And eventually, he gave up trying to force its purpose and instead sat beside it, one ankle casually resting on the other, and waited for the staircase to tell him what it was for. And over time, he noticed that those who stood on that one step, even for a moment, tended to sigh or smile faintly, or forget what they'd been hurrying toward, as if the act of stepping down even once was enough to change the rhythm of their day, and a quiet understanding grew around it, that the staircase wasn't broken or incomplete. It was intentional, a gentle reminder that not every descent needs to be dramatic, not every journey needs to lead somewhere far. Sometimes, a single step downward is just what's needed to arrive more fully in the present moment, and Hades began to visit it often, not for answers, but for pause, bringing with him a cup of something warm, usually fig leaf tea steeped in silence, and sitting on that one step as if it were the whole staircase. Because in a world that's always asking us to climb or descend endlessly, sometimes one step is the perfect number. And maybe you too have such a step inside you, the kind that doesn't demand movement or change, but invites you to settle, to let your breath drop by just one beat, to lower your thoughts like setting down a book with no ending, and tonight, as the hush gathers and the day folds itself inward, step onto that place within you. Not down, not forward, just once, and let it be enough. In the farthest recess of Hades' garden, where the moss grew thick like murmurs and the air always felt faintly like rain that had changed its mind, there stood a clock, perched atop a slender pedestal made of forgotten vows, and from a distance, it looked like any other timepiece. Round face, 2 hands, glass slightly smudged, but it held a peculiar trait, one that Hades noticed only after several slow visits, that when left entirely alone, unobserved, unconsidered, the clock would begin to tick backward, not quickly or dramatically, but subtly, like an old thought returning quietly through a dream. And the moment anyone looked at it, truly focused on it, it resumed ticking forward as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just reversed half a memory, and this amused Hades to no end, for he found it a perfect metaphor for the way reflection works in the soul, that time moves differently when we stop measuring it, and soon he found himself leaving small objects at the base of the clock, an old sandal, a dried plum, a folded napkin from a conversation long past, just to see if they felt different after resting near it. And they did, not visibly, but with that curious weight that makes you think twice before tossing them away. And sometimes he would sit nearby, eyes closed, imagining the hours unspooling backward behind him, undoing conversations, softening regrets, erasing expectations like chalk under a gentle rain. And he wondered what it meant, this quiet defiance of linearity, this rebellion by stillness. And perhaps the clock wasn't defying time, but simply reminding anyone who cared to notice that time was more flexible than they thought, especially when it came to healing, to remembering, to resting. And maybe that's why the clock never made a sound, because it didn't want to be caught, didn't want to be useful, it just wanted to exist in its own rhythm. And maybe you too have moments like that, when your mind wanders backwards without meaning to, revisiting softness, reshaping old stories not to change them, but to understand them differently. And tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift in spirals rather than lines, let them do so freely. Let them revisit, rewind, repeat, because not all time needs to march forward. Some of it is meant to return, to hold you gently in place, and to whisper that nothing is truly lost when you are still. And so Hades, after many evenings watching the hands spin imperceptibly against the hush of the garden, decided the clock wasn't broken at all, but rather a reminder that stillness had its own kind of timekeeping, and in that backward rhythm lay the heartbeat of memories not as burdens but as lullabies, folding back over themselves to be rocked again. And every now and then, when he felt too heavy from the weight of eternity, he would walk past it, not looking, not asking, and let it quietly unwind some of the tangle inside him, so gently he never even noticed the knots coming undone. And perhaps that's how all true resting begins, not with declarations or alarms, but with a slow turn inward, a backward step into softness, a quiet clock whispering it's okay to take your time, even if your time takes you backward. In the quiet dining chamber just off the Hall of Forgotten Toasts, where echoes of old speeches still clung lazily to the stone walls, like crumbs on a linen napkin, there sat a single unremarkable drinking cup, carved from dark clay with a lip worn smooth by centuries of contemplative sipping. And though the Underworld had its share of enchanted goblets, bottomless amphorae, and celebratory chalices that once foamed with nectar at a mere compliment, this cup did nothing of the sort. Instead, it filled itself only with silence. Not emptiness exactly, but a soft, calming hush that felt like velvet folded in moonlight. And whenever Hades picked it up, intending to sip something, wine, tea, the occasional rosewater, infused with night-blooming herbs, he found it held only a deep stillness that somehow quenched him better than any liquid could. And the first time it happened, he stared into it for a long while, half expecting a riddle or a ripple. But it gave nothing back but his own breathing, softened and slowed like waves over long memory. And so it became his favourite cup, not for drinking but for arriving, and over time it earned a place at every table he visited, often placed quietly beside more elaborate vessels as if to say, you may speak or you may sit. And the other gods found it strange, of course, especially Dionysus, who once tried to pour wine into it, only to watch the liquid evaporate into silence with a faint chime that sounded suspiciously like a sigh of relief. And even Persephone once asked, teasing, "Do you drink your loneliness from that?" To which Hades replied, "Only when I want to hear it clearly." And maybe that was the point of the cup. Not to fill, not to serve, but to hold space. The way a pause does in a conversation you're not ready to end, and in time, word of the cup spread among the shades and stewards, and those who needed quiet more than answers would come sit near it. Not to ask for blessings, but simply to feel the way it made noise step aside. And if you ever wandered into that chamber at the right hour, you'd find no feasting, no music, no laughter. Only a stillness so rich it felt poured deep and settling like the first breath after a long silence. And maybe you too have needed such a cup. Not one that quenches your thirst but your thinking. One that doesn't fill your body but empties your weight. One that says, it's all right to sit here and not speak and still be heard. And tonight, as your own thoughts begin to dim their voices, let them gather in such a vessel, not to be solved or sorted, but to be set down gently, and let the hush of that imagined cup soothe the places inside you that have run too long without pause. There was a path, softly worn into the grey soil of the underworld, traced not by chariots or grand processions, but by feet that wandered slowly, thoughtfully, over lifetimes. And though it looked ordinary at first glance, a gentle curve winding through asphodel fields, under sleeping willow branches, past a quiet spring that gurgled like a child dreaming, it held a quiet secret known only to those who had walked its full length, that no matter how far you travelled, no matter how many turns you counted, the path always led you back to where you started, not in some grand magical flourish, but subtly, kindly, like a lullaby returning to its first note without asking for applause, and Hades discovered it by accident, which, in his case, usually meant he'd been looking for something else entirely, perhaps a misplaced scroll or an old pair of gloves left near the judging stone, and instead found himself following the trail simply because it seemed to invite the kind of walking that didn't require decision-making, and with each step, his thoughts softened, not quite dissolving but stretching out like a cat in sunlight, and by the time he noticed he was passing the same sleeping willow for the second, or was it the third, time, he felt no irritation, only the pleasant disorientation of having lost his sense of linear progress. And when he finally arrived back at the original stone that marked the beginning, he stood still and smiled, because the path had done something he hadn't realized he needed. It had let him move without going anywhere, and there was peace in that. The way there's comfort in rereading the same bedtime story for the 100th time, not to learn something new, but to remember what soft feels like. And after that day, he marked the beginning of the path not with a sign but with a small stone bench carved from old intentions, and sometimes he would sit there as shades walked the loop, watching them notice, slowly, eventually, that they were circling, and none ever complained, because by the time they returned, they always looked lighter, as if what they'd carried had been set down one step at a time without them realizing it. And perhaps you've walked such a path too, not through fields of asphodel but around your kitchen late at night, or pacing your thoughts in quiet circles that start and end in the same breath. And maybe that's all right. Maybe not every journey needs a destination. Not every effort needs to break new ground. Maybe some walks are meant to bring you gently back to where you began, so you can see it with softer eyes. And tonight, as your mind takes its own steps towards sleep, let it walk this path with no map, no urgency, no need for change. Just movement for the sake of unwinding, and return to yourself a little more whole than before. On the third shelf of a crooked bookcase in the far wing of the Underworld's lesser-known archive, a place so quiet even silence wore slippers, there rested a book, bound in soft leather the colour of overcast skies and etched with a title no one could remember reading aloud. And it wasn't that the book was particularly old or particularly wise, but that it changed every time someone forgot it. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, thoughtfully, like a dream adjusting its meaning just before you wake, and Hades discovered this by forgetting it himself, which he was not prone to do. But this book had a way of fading politely from one's memory, like a guest who always cleaned up after themselves and never overstayed. And when he returned to it after what he thought was only a week, though time is slipperier than usual down there, he found that the story inside had rearranged itself, not in plot or characters, but in feeling, as if the emotional weather of the narrative had shifted to match the parts of himself he hadn't yet sorted out. And the ending, which had once closed like a firm handshake, now settled like a sigh through soft fabric. And this intrigued him more than it unsettled him, for in a world full of fixed fates and eternal declarations, here was something that allowed space for forgetting and returning, for re-understanding things at the speed of feeling rather than the pace of logic, and so he began to leave it unread on purpose, tucking it into corners and letting the dust get to know it again, waiting weeks, months, even centuries before reopening it, and each time the ending met him not with surprise but with recognition, as if the book had been keeping pace with him in the background of thought, updating its final page to mirror what his heart might need more than what his mind might expect. And word of it spread slowly among the archivists and ghost scribes, who began using it not as a text to study, but as a place to leave unspoken questions, letting it be their unread mirror, and perhaps you too have something like that. A journal you haven't. Opened, a song you've paused halfway through, a memory waiting to be retold once your heart has caught up to it, and maybe tonight, instead of rushing to resolve or to remember, you can let some things stay unread just a little longer, knowing that when you return they will meet you gently, not with answers, but with endings rewritten in the quiet language of who you've become. Tucked into the corner of an old phonograph cabinet that nobody remembered placing in the Underworld's music room, a room mostly used by the wind sneaking through harp strings and the occasional hum from a ghost rehearsing an apology, was a small dust-freckled record that bore no label, no title, no hint of origin, and when someone placed it on the turntable and gently lowered the needle, it always played a melody that felt strangely familiar, yet utterly unique, as if it had been composed in real time to match the listener's most forgotten emotions. And the first time Hades heard it, the music sounded like autumn air meeting warm bread, like the sigh of a letter that never needed to be sent. And though he tried many times to replicate it, same setting, same hour, even the same posture on the same creaky stool, it never played the same tune again. Not for him, not for anyone, and the song, it seemed, lived entirely in the space between expectation and memory, shapeless until heard, forming itself from the quietest corners of one's past. And this was not magic in the flashy incantation sense, but something more honest, more deeply rooted, like the way a scent can undo you or a colour can hush your whole body. And others began to visit the room not to study the song but to be gently reshaped by it, and some laughed softly as the notes tangled through memories of childhood soup or an old friend's nickname, while others cried not from sadness but from recognition, as if the music had finally made room for a feeling they hadn't known how to carry. And Hades, ever the collector of things unspoken, began to see this record as less of an object and more of a listener itself, something that absorbed instead of expressed, translating the shape of your silence into notes only you could hear, and he never locked it away, never tried to control it, only made sure that the room around it stayed undisturbed, with a single lamp glowing like thought and a chair that always felt warmed, even if no one had sat there all day. And maybe you've known such a song, not one you can sing or even remember, but one that comes to you in a moment so specific and soft it feels written for your breath. And tonight, as you rest your head and let your edges blur, imagine that song shaping itself quietly around you, not to teach or entertain, but to remind you that you're heard even when you have no words to offer, and that your quietest truths still carry a melody of their own. Deep within a wardrobe made of moon-burnished wood, tucked between a ceremonial robe that hummed faintly with old echoes, and a pair of gloves stitched with thread made from spider size, sat a pair of shoes that had belonged to no one in particular, yet had worn themselves into legend simply by disobeying the most basic rule of all footwear. They refused, absolutely refused, to walk in straight lines, and though they looked ordinary enough, soft leather, humble stitching, soles smoothed by centuries, they carried within them the quiet will of wandering, a gentle insistence on meandering that made even the most deliberate path curve like a drifting feather. And Hades, who had long since stopped being surprised by the oddities of his realm, first discovered them during a slow day when his thoughts felt too square and his errands too logical, and he slipped them on just to stretch his mind sideways. But what followed was not a walk so much as a surrender to directionlessness, a stroll that bent softly through hallways he thought he'd forgotten, past rooms that seemed to lean toward his steps like curious cats, and he ended up, hours or maybe days later, under a fig tree he'd never seen before, its roots shaped like punctuation marks and its fruit tasting faintly of childhood, and as he sat beneath it, the shoes rested beside him with the tired patience of things that had been misunderstood for too long, and from then on, he kept them not for travel but for unthinking, for moments when the straight road felt too heavy and the map too loud, and he began to offer them to others, not to lead them somewhere, but to remind them that not all movement must make sense, that sometimes the soft zigzag of uncertainty is the very thing that unwinds a knotted mind, and eventually Persephone tried them too, laughing as they led her gently in circles around the same wildflower 3 times until she knelt to smell it and remembered why she used to paint. And perhaps you've had days like that, where your footsteps betray your plans, where you end up somewhere unexpected, not because you were lost, but because part of you knew that straight lines often skip the most interesting parts. And tonight, as your thoughts begin to slow and soften, let them wander. Not to solve, not to finish, just to meander like those worn leather shoes, curving gently through the landscape of dreams, stepping softly into places you didn't know you'd missed. In the westmost wing of the palace, just beyond the hallway where light tended to bend a little slower, and thoughts hung in the air like drowsy birds mid-glide, there was a single curtain, a plain one made of coarse, slightly faded fabric the colour of old paper in late dusk, that hung over a window which had no view, and though it never rustled when wind passed or footsteps approached, it was never quite in the same place twice, always shifting slightly, as if adjusting itself in response to something just missed, like the sigh of a rumour remembering an old conversation. And Hades noticed it first not because of movement but because of stillness, the kind that makes you realise something has changed only when you aren't paying attention. And at first, he assumed it was simply settling, or perhaps the weight of passing centuries had made the fabric stretch and sway differently. But one evening, through the quiet gardens where the fig trees dreamed and the gravel hummed underfoot like tiny lullabies, he paused in front of the curtain and decided, on a soft whim, to turn his back to it and wait, and for several minutes he stood in silence, listening not for noise but for presence, and just when he began to think the moment had passed, he felt the subtlest shift in the air, a whisper of motion, like the breath of an idea too gentle to say out loud. And when he turned around, the curtain was swaying ever so slightly, not in response to him, but as if it had just remembered a story and was telling it to the wall. And from that moment on, he never tried to catch it in motion again, understanding that some things only move when unobserved, only live when left alone, and that maybe the curtain wasn't there to reveal anything, but to reflect the way some parts of ourselves rearrange only in privacy, only in the soft light between awareness and forgetfulness, and others began to notice too, not in loud declarations, but in the way they paused when passing by, offering the curtain a kind of respectful glance, as if to say, "I won't ask what you're doing," and Hades in turn began placing small offerings near it, not of fruit or gold, but of quiet moments, like a folded page from a book that made him exhale sharply, or the last sip of tea left untouched. And sometimes Persephone would join him, leaning against the wall and letting their silences mingle with the stillness, neither speaking of the curtain but both knowing it had earned its place by asking for nothing and offering only the mystery of gentle change. And maybe you too have something like that in your life. A space, a memory, a part of yourself that shifts only when no one is looking. And perhaps tonight, as the edges of your thoughts soften like curtains in low light, you can let them move freely, unobserved, without needing to be explained or held still. Because some truths are like fabric at dusk. They're clearest when not stared at, and most comforting when simply allowed to sway. In the Underworld's least visited kitchen, nestled between the archive of unfinished menus and the corridor where cinnamon was once mistaken for ash, there rested a spoon unlike any other, though at first glance it appeared perfectly ordinary, with a long wooden handle smoothed by age and a bowl dulled from generations of ghostly stews. And yet it had a curious tendency to stir on its own, not in dramatic circles or clattering spins, but with a quiet, consistent motion that didn't seem to touch the contents at all, as if the spoon were not moving the liquid but simply encouraging it to remember its own rhythm. And Hades stumbled upon it one evening while waiting for a pot of fig leaf broth to boil, a dish that never quite boiled but rather thought about boiling for several hours, when he noticed the spoon rocking slowly, not touching the edges, not dipping too deep, just moving as if in conversation with the heat itself. And instead of stopping it or analysing the mechanics, he simply watched, mesmerised by the way the liquid responded, not with turbulence, but with agreement, forming soft swirls that seemed to nod back at the spoon's unspoken intentions. And over time he began to use it not just for cooking, but for calming himself, placing it into empty bowls and watching the space inside swirl gently, like the inside of a quiet mind unwinding after a loud day. And Persephone, amused at first, tried it during one of her late-night recipe experiments, and found that the spoon stirred even when there was nothing in the bowl, as if reminding them both that motion didn't always need an object, that sometimes simply moving gently was enough to change everything, and soon it became a ritual, a kind of meditation, placing the spoon into a vessel, waiting and letting it show what kind of rhythm the air needed, and the ghosts who worked in the kitchen began to notice it too, treating the spoon not as a tool, but as a companion, something to be consulted rather than commanded. Down a narrow hall lined with shelves of empty ink bottles and soft-spoken ledgers that once held dreams too subtle to catalogue, there stood a door, plain and unmarked, its hinges tarnished and its handle always cool to the touch, no matter the season of the soul, and what made it strange wasn't its appearance or its location, but that it only ever opened when the person standing before it had fully forgotten why they came, and Hades, being no stranger to the paradoxes of his realm, discovered this truth after many fruitless attempts to enter, always approaching with questions, with intentions, with a purpose coiled neatly in the palm of his mind. Yet the door never budged, not even a whisper of movement, not even a creak of interest, and it wasn't until one particularly foggy afternoon, when he arrived in front of it for reasons so vague they melted, even as he considered them, that the handle turned smoothly beneath his fingers, and the door sighed open like an exhale from the end of a long sentence, revealing a small circular room filled with the kind of warm, indifferent light that makes your bones forget how long they've been carrying you. And inside were only cushions, soft, well-worn, oddly shaped as if designed by memory rather than architecture, and a faint aroma of something familiar but unplaceable, like an old friend's kitchen or the sleeve of your favourite sweater. And he sat, not because he planned to, but because the room asked nothing of him, and in that absence of expectation, something unclenched, not in his body, but in his story, as if a part of his narrative had found its bookmark again, and from then on, he never tried to enter the door with intention, instead letting his feet carry him there whenever purpose had grown too sharp, whenever ambition began to echo too loudly inside his thoughts, and sometimes others found it too, accidentally, unintentionally, exactly when they'd lost the thread of their errands, and each left with nothing in hand but everything slightly softer inside. And maybe you've had moments like that, where the thing you sought arrived only after you stopped looking, when the weight of wanting slipped away and what remained was a quiet door swinging open into rest. And tonight, let yourself forget what it was you thought you needed to solve, and instead stand quietly before that inner door, breathing gently, and let it open not to answers, but to softness. Tucked beneath a stone archway in the quietest guest room of the Underworld, a room visited only by moonlight and the occasional breeze that didn't know it was lost, there rested a pillow, not embroidered with myth or filled with phoenix feathers, but simply made of worn-down softness and the kind of quiet only time could weave. And while at first glance it seemed like any other place to lay one's head, there was something gently peculiar about it. For anyone who slept upon it would awake with a clear, vivid sense of every dream they had ever forgotten, each one curling gently back into memory, like mist drawn home by gravity. But the pillow itself remembered none of them, holding space for everyone else's stories while never keeping even a sliver of its own, and Hades, ever the collector of things unspoken, discovered its secret one night after dozing there without intention, only to rise with the faint but unmistakable memory of a dream from his youth, an image of a tree made entirely of keys, each rusted just enough to hum, and as he sat there blinking into the soft shadows, he ran his hand along the pillow's surface and felt nothing but surrender. The kind of yielding that asks for no thanks, no name, and over time he offered the pillow to others, shades with tangled pasts, guests with echoes in their voices, even Persephone once, who woke laughing about a fig that could talk but only in compliments. And they always left lighter, not because they dreamed, but because the dreams found them again, rethreading their forgotten meanings like warm stitches in an old coat. And never once did the pillow ask for recognition. Never once did it imprint or imprint upon. Simply giving space, remembering for the sake of others, never for itself. And maybe you've known such a place. Perhaps not a pillow, but a moment, a song, a hand on your shoulder, that holds you without taking, that offers rest without request. And tonight, as your head lowers gently onto your own resting place, let the part of you that carries forgotten dreams settle into the comfort of something that remembers them for you. Not to burden, not to explain, but just to keep them safe, so you can drift without needing to hold everything all at once, and let that kindness carry you softly into sleep. Hanging from a beam above a stone archway no one walked through anymore. Not out of fear, but out of simple forgetfulness. There swayed a small bronze bell, aged to a soft green, and chipped in just the right places to make it clear it had once been rung often. And though many in the Underworld believed it to be merely decorative, like a leftover sentiment from a ceremony that never quite took place, Hades knew better, for he had long noticed that the bell had a peculiar habit. It only rang when absolutely nothing was happening. Not during silences filled with tension, not in pauses heavy with meaning, but in those rare, delicate moments when truly nothing moved. Not thought, not plan, not time, as if the bell could detect the precise instant when the universe exhaled without needing to breathe back in, and it never rang loudly, more a soft chime than a declaration, a sound like the feeling of a hand brushing against your sleeve with no intent but warmth. And the first time Hades heard it, he was reading a recipe that called for exactly 1.5 dandelions, which was confusing enough to still his thoughts completely. And that's when it rang, just once, and he looked up, not startled but returned, as though the sound had reminded him he existed between actions, not only within them, and over time, he began to wait for the bell. Not chase it, not summon it, but create the kind of stillness it liked to visit, and when it rang he would simply smile, not because it meant anything, but because it meant nothing so completely, and eventually others heard it too, always when they weren't expecting to, always in the middle of doing nothing in particular, tracing the grain of a table, watching a fig ripen, holding an old glove with no reason but memory, and each time it rang, the moment became whole, as if crowned by quiet. And maybe you too have needed such a bell, not to call you to action, but to mark your rest, not to summon urgency, but to bless your stillness. And tonight, as your thoughts slow and the spaces between them grow wider, listen for that bell, not with your ears, but with your breath, and let it ring softly in the center of your nothing, telling you that this too is sacred. At the end of a gently curving corridor where the floor dipped like a thought reconsidered and the walls were lined with faded portraits of people who might never have lived, there hung a single lantern, unlit, unremarkable, shaped like a teardrop paused in glass. And what made it quietly magical wasn't its design, nor the fact that it floated just a little without quite leaving its hook, but that it only ever lit up when you turned your back on it. And Hades noticed this not through observation, but by accident, during one of those aimless evening walks he often took when the weight of decisions pressed too tightly against his temples. And as he passed the lantern one night with his head bowed in thought, a soft glow appeared behind him, warming the stone in a hush of gold, and when he turned to look it was gone, completely, utterly, as if it had never existed. And so he walked away again, slowly, and again it glowed, not to show the path ahead, but to gently comfort what had already been walked. And the moment he turned to chase the light, it vanished, like kindness not meant to be caught, only received, and he began visiting it more often, especially on days that frayed at the edges, learning to trust the light behind him without needing proof. And over time he realized the lantern wasn't meant to guide the steps forward, but to reassure the parts of himself already passed through, to say, "You walked this and that was enough." And Persephone, curious as ever, tried it too, and smiled when it lit behind her, whispering, "It likes being trusted." And maybe you've needed such a lantern. Not one to show the future or banish the dark ahead, but one that glows only after you've moved on, casting a soft light over where you've already been, letting you know you are never truly alone there. And tonight, as your breath finds its rhythm and your thoughts begin to turn away from the noise of the day, imagine such a lantern glowing gently behind you, not to call you back, but to thank you for how far you've come, and let that quiet light ease you forward into dreaming. It started, as soft things often do, in a forgotten room at the very edge of the Underworld's oldest guest quarters, the kind of room no one ever meant to visit but always ended up wandering into when they were too tired to think and too quiet to be heard, where the air smelled gently of thyme and dry lavender, and the windows let in a sort of sleepy light that didn't come from anywhere in particular. And on the bed in that room, a bed slightly crooked at one leg and always warm no matter how long it had been left alone, was a quilt that looked as if it had been stitched not by hand but by memory itself, made from patches so mismatched and gently frayed that one could spend hours just tracing the edge of a square and wondering where the cloth had once lived before it was sewn into this soft mosaic. And what made the quilt curious, even by Underworld standards, wasn't that it was magical in the way lightning is, or spells are, or golden coins tossed into wishing wells are, but rather that it responded to kindness. Not dramatic, sweeping, applause-worthy gestures, but the small ones, the quiet ones, the kind that people hardly notice themselves making, like offering someone the last fig on the plate without needing thanks, or adjusting someone's pillow without waking them, or speaking gently to the furniture as you dusted it. And when such a kindness occurred anywhere within the walls of that room, the quilt would change. Not all at once, not like a firework or a gasp, but slowly, patiently, the way a new thought forms, or how shadows shift in the afternoon with one patch, brightening a shade, another softening its weave, and sometimes a brand new square would appear entirely, tucked in near the edge like a secret freshly remembered. And Hades, who had never been one for linens or domestic things, found himself returning to the room more and more often, sometimes with a book he had no intention of finishing, sometimes just with a tired mind and a warm drink in hand, and he would sit on the edge of the bed and speak quietly, not to the quilt, but to himself, or perhaps to Persephone in memory, or to the silence, sharing thoughts that had no weight but still wanted to be set down, and as he spoke, soft, unimportant things like, "I saw a shade try to befriend a shadow today," or "I don't remember when I last saw someone laugh with their shoulders." The quilt would shift under his hand, curling slightly toward him, as if in understanding, its patches shifting hues not to impress, but to reflect. And soon the legend of the quilt grew, not in storybooks, for those were rarely updated in the land of the dead, but in whispered conversation passed from one gentle soul to another, and shades who had long forgotten the rhythm of giving began to leave offerings of kindness like folded napkins, repaired buttons, or apologies never sent. And each act was remembered not with celebration but with warmth, the way embers remember fire, or how a well-worn path remembers every footfall without judging the direction. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the quilt's strange magic was that it never remembered cruelty, never stitched in anger or absorbed the sharpness of words, instead allowing such things to pass through it like wind through curtains, choosing only to keep what softened the world rather than what hardened it. And over time, the quilt became not just a thing to cover oneself with, but a quiet listener, a wordless journal of grace. And Persephone, upon hearing of it, lay beneath it one afternoon with her eyes closed and simply whispered, "I'm trying." And the quilt, in its way, glowed just slightly, a shimmer not seen but felt, and Hades watched this from the doorway, not with pride or awe, but with the same expression he wore when tending to delicate vines that grew in forgotten corners. And maybe you've longed for something like this, a space where your smallest efforts at kindness are not ignored but deeply remembered, not displayed but understood. And maybe tonight, as your head settles into your own pillow, You can imagine a patchwork quilt unfolding gently across your body, not stitched with fabric, but with all the soft words you've spoken and every small act of grace you never even noticed, wrapping around you like moonlight and memory, whispering back every kindness you've given in a language only your quietest self can hear. And perhaps the most peculiar thing was that the quilt never changed when watched directly, never shifted under eager eyes or performed under pressure, instead waiting for moments of unself-conscious care, blooming only in the periphery of attention, like a flower that opens only when you stop checking the window. And this meant that many never saw it change at all, though they felt it. Subtle warmth in the toes, a feeling that some burden had been lifted not from the body but from the day itself. A sensation that perhaps, just perhaps, something good had been noticed, even if not named. And once, during a particularly cold month when even the sun seemed reluctant to show its face, and the fog in the underworld refused to lift from the marble floors, a child shade wandered into the room holding a broken spoon and a question too big for words. And when she sat on the bed and said simply, "I miss someone," the quilt beneath her changed so tenderly it was as if it had exhaled the name for her. And one of the patches, formerly a dull checkered blue, unfolded into a swirl of colours no one could describe, but everyone agreed looked like forgiveness. And Hades, who was passing by with a stack of unsorted petitions, stopped in the hallway not because he heard something, but because he felt something, a stillness that tasted like closure, and over time he grew to respect the quilt as not just a strange object, but a kind of soft archive, a record not of history, but of how people made each other feel. And when the underworld held festivals, quiet ones, more like shared silences than celebrations, Hades would sometimes move the quilt temporarily into a sitting room near the fireplaces, letting others simply sit beside it, not for spectacle but for reflection, and shades would leave things near it without speaking, items they no longer needed but still loved, like the final note of a song they once hummed or the shoelaces they tied for someone else, and always, always, the quilt absorbed only what was offered with softness. And one day a spirit tried to lie to it, whispering a compliment with bitterness behind it, and the quilt did not reject him or punish him. It simply remained still, quietly unchanged, until the shade sat back down and tried again, this time meaning it, this time whispering, "I hope you're less tired tomorrow," to no one in particular, and only then did the patch above his knee bloom gently into the colour of morning tea. And when Persephone asked Hades once why he kept the quilt at all, when he could store it in the vaults or the library of misfit enchantments, he answered not with words but by laying it over her shoulders. And that night she dreamed of fields of soft moss and people hugging without urgency. And when she awoke, she understood everything she needed to. And perhaps, dear listener, you've been near such a thing. Not a magical quilt necessarily, but an unseen witness to your quiet care. A moment where something in the universe noticed your gentleness and responded not with applause but with calm. And tonight, as you begin to drift further from the noise of your day and into the soft glow of your night, know that somewhere in some cozy corner of a world that only reveals itself to those who move gently, there is a patch being stitched just for you, made from the echo of your kindness and the shape your breath takes when you sigh in relief. And by the time the quilt had been with them for several centuries, though time in the underworld folded more than it flowed, its patches had become more than fabric. They were emotional cartography, quiet topographies of human gentleness, some patterned like the shape of someone's first thank you, others textured like the first time someone forgave themselves without saying it aloud. And when Persephone returned each spring, she often asked to sit beside it before unpacking her garden tools, just to let the quiet kindness wrap around her like a prelude to blooming. And the quilt never demanded attention but somehow always earned it, the way twilight earns your gaze without calling your name. And one evening, as the wind moved lazily through the cypress groves, and even the olives seemed to whisper slower, a shade who had long forgotten their own name but still remembered the warmth of an old cat placed their hand softly on the quilt and said, "I never got to say thank you." And though no one knew exactly who the words were for, the patch beneath that hand turned the colour of warm milk and soft fur, and the room smelled faintly of memory, not a specific one but the scent of having been loved. And Hades, sitting in the corner with a mug of something he never quite finished, felt his breath deepen. Not because of grief, but because of recognition. And it was in that moment he realized the quilt did not simply remember acts of kindness. It remembered the feeling of being kind, the way your chest opens slightly when you care, the way your voice softens when you mean it. And there was no hierarchy to the quilt's memory, no greater reward for grand gestures or elaborate self-sacrifice, for it valued the way someone tied their companion's sandal strap just as much as the way someone offered their seat in a moment of silence. And over time, the quilt began to appear in dreams, not as a blanket, but as a presence, a glow, a soft companion curling around those who'd given quietly, and many would wake without knowing why they felt less alone, why the day ahead seemed more manageable. And maybe, just maybe, it's because the quilt had curled around them too, stitching a piece of their kindness into someone else's comfort. For that was its secret all along, not just to remember but to share, to take the warmth you offered and carry it to another who needed it, like a message passed along by moonlight and folded time. And tonight, as you settle deeper into your own blanket, into your own breath, into this small moment of calm, imagine that quilt, made from softness and silence and stitched memories, gently covering you, not to hide you but to hold you, not to warm your body but to remember the warmth you've given. And as it rests around your shoulders, know this: every kind word you've ever spoken still lives somewhere. Every small grace still ripples outward, and even if you can't see it, something in this universe remembers, responds, and wraps itself back around you when you need it most. In the quietest alcove of the Underworld's forgotten archives, nestled between a shelf of unfinished lullabies and a box of keys that never unlocked anything but memories, sat an hourglass so modest in appearance you might mistake it for decoration. Its glass gently smudged by time and its wooden frame, carved with curves so subtle they felt like the suggestion of vines rather than their likeness. And unlike the grand timekeepers that counted centuries or the celestial clocks that ticked in accordance with prophecy, this hourglass refused to measure minutes or moments or even days. Instead, it recorded only stillness, and not just the absence of movement, but the true hush that comes when even thought sits down to rest, when breath becomes so soft it feels borrowed, and when the world does not pause but simply lets go. And Hades, who often wandered the archives late at night with nothing but candlelight and curiosity to guide him, first noticed the hourglass not because it called attention to itself, but because it didn't. And one evening, when he had stopped beside the shelf just to close his eyes for a breath that turned into many, he opened them to find that a fine layer of golden sand had shifted into the lower chamber. Just a few grains, just enough to say, yes, this counted. And from that night onward, he began to understand that stillness was not the absence of doing, but the presence of being, and the hourglass, quietly kindly, affirmed this without judgment or need for applause. And Persephone, ever intrigued by gentle mysteries, tried sitting before it too, not in meditation, not in concentration, but simply in presence, the way one watches rain or holds a sleeping cat. And after a while she would look up and smile, knowing without looking that the grains had moved again, and over time the hourglass became less an object and more a companion, a silent mirror of the peace they gave themselves permission to feel, and others who found the alcove by accident, usually while searching for something they later forgot, often stayed longer than intended, lulled into stillness not by command but by invitation, and later, when they left, they carried with them not stories of what the hourglass looked like or even where it was, but the memory of how it felt to sit beside it and simply stop reaching. And maybe you've needed such a space too, not a vacation or escape, but a gentle room in time where you could unlace your urgency and let your inner hands be empty for a while. And tonight, as the world outside continues its turning, let your thoughts turn slower. Let your breath stretch out like lazy fog over quiet ground, and imagine that hourglass beside you now, not ticking, not counting, but quietly affirming that your stillness matters, that your rest is real, and that even a moment like this is worth remembering. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. and the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. And the hourglass, never asking for attention, continued its quiet work, letting each grain of stillness settle like stardust upon silence. In a forgotten vestibule tucked behind the Hall of Unfinished Promises, where the scent of parchment and petrichor lingered like an old conversation never quite ended, there stood a mirror, not framed in gold or silver, not polished to brilliance, but dulled slightly around the edges like the memory of a dream you try to hold onto after waking. Tall and gently bowed, it was said to have been crafted not by artisans but by a long, quiet thought. And what made this mirror quietly remarkable was that it refused to reflect what you carried or wore or showed to the world, instead revealing only what you had released, what you had exhaled out of your soul's tightly clenched hand. And when Hades first stood before it, what he saw was not himself in the robes of a king nor the weariness of his godhood, but a fluttering ribbon of something pale and feathered, floating away like steam, an old grudge he had unknowingly abandoned centuries ago. And it did not startle him but rather warmed him, like recognition. And so he returned again and again, not in pursuit of seeing more, but simply to stand there on quiet evenings and remember the value of letting go. And Persephone, curious as always, stepped before it once during a spring moon that had followed her underground like a polite guest. And in that mirror she saw a garden, an entire one, lush and blooming, that she'd once dreamed of planting but never pursued. And she smiled, not in regret but in relief, understanding now that letting go of one dream had made space for others to bloom in its place. And the mirror never spoke, never shimmered, never performed, and yet shades began to find their way there without being told, drawn not by spectacle but by the mirror's strange silence, the way it seemed to hum not in sound but in understanding. And they would come and sit before it, sometimes for hours, sometimes only a moment, and many left with tears they couldn't name, but also a lightness they didn't expect. And perhaps that's what the mirror reflected best. Not the image of what you'd left behind, but the absence of its weight. And some returned with letters they never sent, laying them at the base of the mirror like petals falling from old intentions. And though the mirror never changed its surface, those who returned to it found that each visit revealed something new. Not because the mirror changed, but because they had. And over time, Hades grew to think of it not as a mirror at all, but as a companion, one that held your quietest reliefs without question. And maybe, dear listener, you too have longed for such a reflection, not one of your face, but of your freedom, not of what remains, but what has softly left you. And tonight, as the hush of sleep pulls closer, let your thoughts drift toward that mirror, standing quiet in a room no map contains, and imagine your breath softening, your shoulders releasing, your chest easing open, and before you, in that gentle glass, the floating echoes of what you've set down, fears you no longer need, expectations that melted away like snow in spring. And as you exhale again, let that reflection brighten not with what you see, but with what you've no longer carried, and allow yourself, if only for now, to be held by the lightness of release. In a forgotten vestibule tucked behind the Hall of Unfinished Promises, where the scent of parchment and petrichor lingered like an old conversation never quite ended, there stood a mirror, not framed in gold or silver, not polished to brilliance, but dulled slightly around the edges like the memory of a dream you try to hold on to after waking. Tall and gently bowed, it was said to have been crafted not by artisans, but by a long, quiet thought. And what made this mirror quietly remarkable was that it refused to reflect what you carried or wore or showed to the world, instead revealing only what you had released, what you had exhaled out of your soul's tightly clenched hand. And when Hades first stood before it, what he saw was not himself in the robes of a king nor the weariness of his godhood, but a fluttering ribbon of something pale and feathered, floating away like steam, an old grudge he had unknowingly abandoned centuries ago, and it did not startle him but rather warmed him, like recognition. And so he returned again and again, not in pursuit of seeing more, but simply to stand there on quiet evenings and remember the value of letting go. And Persephone, curious as always, stepped before it once during a spring moon that had followed her underground like a polite guest. And in that mirror she saw a garden, an entire one, lush and blooming, that she'd once dreamed of planting but never pursued. And she smiled, not in regret, but in relief, understanding now that letting go of one dream had made space for others to bloom in its place. And the mirror never spoke, never shimmered, never performed. And yet shades began to find their way there without being told, drawn not by spectacle but by the mirror's strange silence, the way it seemed to hum not in sound but in understanding, and they would come and sit before it, sometimes for hours, sometimes only a moment, and many left with tears they couldn't name, but also a lightness they didn't expect, and perhaps that's what the mirror reflected best, not the image of what you'd left behind, but the absence of its weight. And some returned with letters they never sent, laying them at the base of the mirror like petals falling from old intentions. And though the mirror never changed its surface, those who returned to it found that each visit revealed something new, not because the mirror changed, but because they had, and over time Hades grew to think of it not as a mirror at all, but as a companion, one that held your quietest reliefs without question. And maybe, dear listener, you too have longed for such a reflection. Not one of your face, but of your freedom, not of what remains, but what has softly left you. And tonight, as the hush of sleep pulls closer, let your thoughts drift toward that mirror, standing quiet in a room no map contains, and imagine your breath softening, your shoulders releasing, your chest easing open, and before you, in that gentle glass, the floating echoes of what you've set down, fears you no longer need, expectations that melted away like snow in spring. And as you exhale again, let that reflection brighten not with what you see, but with what you've no longer carried, and allow yourself, if only for now, to be held by the lightness of release. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. And the mirror, never judging and never needing to be understood, simply held space for the truth of your letting go. There was a lantern, old and quiet and the colour of forgotten bronze, hanging from a crooked iron hook in the ceiling of a hallway that curved inward like a question no one had ever dared to answer. A hallway in the underworld where even shadows whispered a little more slowly, and where steps echoed not with sound but with memory. And this lantern did not light up with flame or fire, nor with the touch of hands or the flick of switches or even the will of gods. No, it waited for lost thoughts. The kind that slipped out of your mouth mid-sentence or fluttered away as you walked into a room and forgot why, or disappeared during a conversation you never meant to forget. And when one of those thoughts passed through the veil between awareness and absence, it would flicker gently within the lantern, not with heat, but with a soft, pulsing glow like the feeling of something you almost remember. And over time, Hades came to notice it most during the quieter hours, when the palace stilled and the wind stopped asking questions, and he would stroll past it deliberately slow, pausing to let the silence grow long enough that the lantern would pulse once or twice, just barely, and he found a strange comfort in it. Not in recovering the thoughts, for they were never retrieved, but in knowing that somewhere, somehow, even the things we lose are not truly lost, only held elsewhere, softly. And Persephone, ever curious about the quiet mysteries her realm offered, brought a stool one day and sat beneath it, sketching the way its light shifted with each sigh or murmur or sudden pause, and she noticed that the glow was different for different people. Blue for questions never asked, green for kindness left unsaid, gold for laughter forgotten before it could be shared. And she wondered aloud whether the lantern itself missed the thoughts it held, or whether it simply kept them the way a pebble keeps warmth from the sun, without needing to understand it. And one evening, as two shades passed by mid-conversation, one trailing off into memory and the other continuing unaware, the lantern shimmered softly, catching a fragment of thought that had nowhere else to go, and it pulsed with a melancholy brightness, like the echo of something half-sung, and perhaps, dear listener, you too have felt that flicker. That moment where something important tries to reach the surface but drifts just out of reach. And maybe you've sighed and let it go, thinking it gone forever. But tonight, in the hush of this moment, imagine that lantern above you, not demanding your attention but simply glowing faintly, acknowledging that your lost thoughts are not failures, not flaws, but whispers of meaning waiting to be gently remembered or simply released. And as you drift further into the stillness of your own breath, imagine those small thoughts curling like wisps into that quiet lantern, safe, glowing, and content just to be. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. And the lantern, glowing gently in the hush between thoughts, kept every forgotten flicker safe like a lullaby folded into dusk. Tucked beneath an olive tree older than most myths, and beside a stream that trickled backward on quiet evenings, there rested a wooden bench carved not by tools, but by the slow persistence of memory. And though the wood was gnarled and its grain twisted like stories retold too many times, the bench was solid and warm to the touch, as though it remembered every soul that had ever leaned upon it. And the peculiar thing, what made this bench different from any other in the Underworld, was that it remembered goodbyes, not the ones screamed across oceans or sobbed into pillows, but the soft ones, the half-whispered farewells tucked into hugs, the silent nods from across rooms, the quiet letting-go thoughts folded into last glances. And whenever someone sat upon it with the weight of parting heavy on their chest, the bench would creak not in protest but in welcome, its wooden slats breathing ever so slightly beneath them as if saying, "I know, I remember too." And Hades, who rarely cried but often carried the weight of those who did, found himself drawn to it on nights when the stars felt too far and the candles too dim, bringing with him not prayers but pauses, and sometimes he would sit and murmur names long since gone, not expecting answers but needing the act of remembering to echo somewhere. And Persephone once pressed her hand to the bench and said, "I don't know what I'm saying goodbye to," and the bench seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, not with magic but with recognition, as though her uncertainty was something it had cradled before, and the shades came too. Not all at once, not in procession, but like leaves drifting downstream, drawn by the bench's strange kindness. And they sat with letters they never sent, with shoes too small to wear, with names they hadn't spoken in centuries, and when they rose to leave, they often found themselves lighter, not because their burdens were gone, but because something else was quietly holding them now. Something old and wooden and warm. And maybe you've needed such a place too. Maybe there's something or someone or some version of yourself you once had to say goodbye to. And perhaps you never found the right words, or any words at all. And tonight, as the breeze hushes and your thoughts begin to untangle, imagine yourself sitting on that bench, not to perform a ritual or to fix anything, but simply to be, to lean gently into a place that remembers, a place that creaks with comfort. And as you exhale, let every goodbye you've ever whispered rise softly from your chest like steam from tea, not disappearing, but settling into the grain of that quiet wood, where it will be held, honoured, and never, ever lost. And the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft, with the memory of gentle departures simply held, each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain, and the bench, smooth with the wear of sorrow and soft with the memory of gentle departures, simply held each whispered farewell like a lullaby carved into grain. And as the moonlight shifted through the branches of the old olive tree above, casting patterns like faded lace across the seat, a shade sat down with a scarf they had carried for too long, worn thin by longing, and without saying a word they laid it beside them, letting the bench feel the weight of it. And though the scarf itself didn't vanish or glow or tremble, the air around it softened, like the moment after rain when even the soil sighs and another came. A woman who once sang lullabies to no one in particular, who had kept the memory of a child she never met folded in her breath for centuries, and she whispered, not to be heard but to let the silence listen. And the bench grew warmer, not in temperature but in presence, and the tree above them shed a single olive, as if to mark that some goodbye had just been accepted, and Hades watched from a respectful distance, not as a king but as a witness, understanding more and more that farewells were not endings but rearrangements, soft reconfigurations of love's geography, and Persephone, one hand tucked beneath her chin, traced her fingers along the grain and said, "Sometimes I think every goodbye plants a seed, and this bench is the garden," and he nodded. Because what else could you say to something so perfectly true? And that evening, a wind came not from the west or from the world above, but from within the earth itself, a breath of all the unsaid things that people had folded into farewells and forgotten, and the bench creaked gently in reply, as if every sorrow had a twin in the wood that wanted to hum back its name. And maybe you too, dear listener, have whispered farewells without knowing they were your last, or held on to partings that never got their full moment, and tonight in this stillness that belongs only to you, feel that bench beside you now, not beneath you but around you, holding the soft ache in your chest without trying to solve it, only honouring it, letting it breathe, letting it settle. And as you exhale, maybe for the first time today, feel what it's like to let your goodbyes be shared, be softened, be remembered not with finality, but with quiet understanding. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. And the bench, with its silent promise to hold every soft farewell, continue to listen without end and remember without noise. So now, let it rest. You've wandered through doorways only myths remember. You've listened to lanterns and quilts and benches that carry what words cannot. You've felt the hush between grains of stillness and drifted across soft stories stitched into time. There's nothing left to do. No call to action, no scroll to deliver, just sleep. Peaceful, warm, carried. And if your breath is slower now, if your thoughts feel softer, then the myths did their work. And the final goodbye becomes only the beginning of your next dream. Sweet dreams, friend, whispered softly, from the quiet corners of forgotten myths. Good night. If you drifted off at any point tonight, let me know below. Sleep well. Subscribe only if it feels right. Boring History for Sleep, signing off.